Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another Monday in the gardening world. I have a lot to talk about today. I'll get to all the questions I can today, cover some interesting topics I think are appropriate for this time of year, and just have a chance to chat with you and have an opportunity for you to chat with me. So I'm looking forward to the next 90 minutes as we cover a whole bunch of gardening topics. It's great to see all the regulars checking in. Let's go ahead and start with a question that Myra's asking. Good morning, Gardener Scott. I noticed a few of my blueberry plants in my garden look like toast, almost like they had no water or too much sun exposure, but my garden is under a shade. The soil is moist. This is one of those things, and it's not just blueberries, it holds true for all kinds of plants, tomatoes, peppers, everything. Suddenly, the plants just don't look like they should. And often it isn't an easy answer. So I would suggest looking at the sun, I would suggest looking at the soil, I would suggest considering shade, and you've already done all that kind of stuff. So now, and this is the way a master gardener analyzes a situation. When someone comes to the Master Gardener Help Desk with a problem, you start asking all of the typical questions. The questions about sun and light, the questions about water, the questions about soil. And then if all of those appear to be normal, you start moving into the pests and the nutrition. And you try to whittle down the possibilities for things to not be exactly the way they should, and hopefully you'll arrive at a solution. So Myra, what I suggest to you, since you've already covered all the basics, which seem to be doing okay, also consider the lifespan of the plants. Blueberries are perennials that come back every year, but there are some leaves that will start dying off towards the end of the season, just at the same time that new leaves are starting to pop up. So take a little bit closer look, see if there might be any pests, and just exactly where the damage is on the leaves. If the damage is on the edge of the leaf, then it might be a heat-related issue. If the damage is interior on the leaf, then it might be a pest or a bacteria or a fungus. So there's a lot more to it. I encourage you to start doing a little bit more trying to figure out just exactly what the problem is. If it's an entire plant problem, then it's probably soil-based or there's some type of pest. But it's just little pieces around the edges, it might be entirely natural. That's the problem with gardening, is sometimes it's just really hard to figure out what the problem is when things don't go right. So take away the things that you know are good, and then try to narrow it down to figure out what's bad. Okay, Myra's saying, could this toast-looking plants around the neighborhood and in my garden be due to ash falling? There you go. That's exactly the way to look at it. What's different now than the way it was a week ago when things were right, or a month ago when things are right? And if you've got ash falling, I think that's probably the issue. You might have some actual burning of the leaves from the ash, not like fire burning, but like chemical burning. Or it could be that the leaves are covered up by very fine ash particles, so they're not getting the photosynthesis. So there you go. That's exactly how you try to figure out how a problem has developed, what caused it. In this case, if you got ash falling on your garden, I would say that's probably the issue. So get out there and clean off your plants. Hose them, wash them down, see if that improves a little bit. I know the ash is going to be terrible for quite a while now, so I hope you can bear with it. You might want to put a cover over the plants as well. And I want to start off right away by offering my empathy and my sympathy to everybody around the world, but particularly in California, Oregon, and Washington in the United States with the fires. I have a family member. She lost her home in Oregon, so it's very close to me. I survived a wildfire years ago here in Colorado. It came within a quarter mile of my house. Many of the houses in my neighborhood were burned down. So I definitely feel the pain, and I hope that you can all make it through as well. It's an extremely difficult time. And so it's easy for me. I'm going to try to liven it up a little bit, talk about gardening and how great gardening is, but I do realize that there are a lot of us that are struggling with all kinds of other issues. My son in Louisiana is right in the crosshairs of what's going to be a hurricane later today. So we all have our issues. You saw my videos probably about the freeze damage that I endured, but a true gardener just pushes on, moves forward, things work out well, and we try to take the best, the most positive aspects of gardening to help us get through the day. So I hope you can all use that little bit of positivity to move forward. Okay, I also wanted to touch on a question that Johnny Castile asked. He was motivated by my video about lawns, or the reason why I don't have a lawn, and is planning to put cardboard and wood chips down in his backyard that's primarily shade and pine trees, and asked for any suggestions. And so I throw this out to anybody. When you're thinking about redoing your landscape, not just adding a garden bed, but actually redoing your landscape, really look at what is native, what is natural in your area. And especially if you live in an area with a lot of pine trees, look at the forest plants, look at the native plants. And so if you're going to be redoing your landscape, I would strongly suggest putting in some native shrubs and bushes and maybe smaller trees, and putting in some perennial flowers and some ground covers, and really try to let nature work with you as you try to modify your landscape. I'm doing that in some of the areas of my garden as well as I move forward. If you try to plant something that doesn't do well in shade, or doesn't do well in wood chips, or doesn't really do well in your environment, it's going to be a lot of hard work. It's going to be too much effort, in my opinion. So I think it's a great idea, if you're redoing parts of your yard and landscape, try to go as native and as natural as possible. It will be easier, and now you can focus your attention on the vegetable garden, the things that do take more energy and more time. So there's my 2 cents on that. So thank you so much for that super chat, John from Aurora, a little bit to help out. I appreciate that. That's a great way to start a Monday, with a super chat. Okay, let's get to some more questions that are popping up. Laura is saying, Gardener Scott, I pulled a little radish last night and it tasted terrible. I planted it around the beginning of August when we were still very hot. Should I pull the rest and start over because of the heat? I would say yes, that's a possibility. Radishes in particular, because they grow so quickly, if they have that heat, they're stressed, and often the taste is bitter, or it's too strong, or it's got a lot of heat to it. The radishes that taste the sweetest and that have the best flavor are the ones that grow in cooler conditions. So in this case, yeah, because radishes grow so quickly, I would say pulling them out, if you notice that it's not just one, but a bunch of them, try other taste tests. But pull a bunch of your radishes. If you find that they all taste terrible, pull them out, feed them to the chickens, throw them on your compost pile, use them as mulch, but you've got enough time to probably put in another radish crop while it's cool, and you should notice a huge improvement in the flavor for radishes that are growing in cool weather compared to radishes that are growing in hot weather. That's a good question. We have Georgia Gardener Kevin. Gardener Scott, I'm planting turnips and I've had problems with aphids in the past. Any advice to keep them off the greens? I'm thinking covering with a tulle fabric. Covering with a fabric can help. The problem with aphids is they're so small they can actually get through a lot of the fabrics. And turnips are one of those plants that so many insects love. I had problems this year with aphids on my turnips. I had just about every insect you can think of, from grasshoppers to flea beetles on my turnips this year. Turnips are really hardy, sturdy plants, and they have a lot of leaves. And so if the only insect you have is an aphid, I actually wouldn't worry too much about it, because one of the best ways to deal with aphids on your plants is just with a good spray of water. So take your hose, spray those leaves that can handle the damage of the water. Well, actually, the water won't damage the turnip leaves because they're so strong. But that water burst will actually knock off the aphids. And so the water may initially kill the aphids. If not, it'll damage because they're very soft-bodied insects. But then it'll knock the aphids onto your mulch and your soil, and they're so small that they'll never climb their way back onto your plant. Think about the equivalent distance of these small aphids that have been harmed by falling off a plant after you sprayed them with water. They're not going to find their way back to your plant and climb up and cause any more damage. You might have to do that over a period of days, but a good strong stream of water on your turnips will take care of aphids, and you'll probably notice minimal damage after that. Okay, Prepper Chris, good to see you again. Gardener Scott, if a berry bush's shoot is dead, can it still grow next year? Very possibly. So a lot of berries will send up new shoots from their roots. And so, for instance, raspberries. I grow raspberries. If the main shoot, the main stalk dies, as long as the roots are still alive, you can expect in the spring that new shoots will pop up from those roots. And that holds true with a lot of berries. I have a currant bush in my front yard. Same thing. I started having new shoots popping up around the edges of the main plant that I put in last year. So most berries, I won't say all berries, but most berries, at least the ones I've grown, will send up shoots. And even if the main plant or the main stalk dies, give it a little bit of time, wait till spring, keep watering, don't let the soil dry out. Don't be surprised if you don't get some new shoots. Michelle, thank you for that super chat as well. Had to ask, off from work to do it, but I made it. So happy to be part of today. I'm so happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us, Michelle. Thanks for that super chat. That's wonderful. Samina's asking, do whiteflies cause problems in the garden? It depends on the infestation, but for the most part, whiteflies are one of those kind of insects that are more annoying than damage causing. And they'll also, because they're small, you can blow them off with a good spray of water as well. So I've never really tried to do much about whiteflies. You can use things like neem oil on your plants, but for the most part, I see whiteflies as food for a lot of the other beneficial insects in the garden. So it might be a nuisance of a pest, but typically it's not going to cause that much problem. If it is a problem for you, then yes, you might be able to take some chemical actions to deal with whiteflies. I like to try sticky traps, and this holds true for a lot of these small flying insects. If you put up sticky traps, and you can get them on Amazon, at nurseries, it's basically just a card, usually yellow, that's very sticky. And the color tends to attract a lot of these nuisance bugs. They land on that sticky trap and they're done. So I did have some white fly issues when I was growing in the greenhouse years ago, and I put up the sticky traps all over. It dealt with that issue. The same with fungus gnats, very effective against fungus gnats. So spray of water, sticky traps, or just live with them. It's usually not that big a problem. Katie Law says, Gardener Scott, my son bought a property in the San Juan Islands of Washington with a very old apple tree. They've tried to identify it but haven't been able to. What resource might they turn to ID it? Good question. There's actually, I can't remember the name of it, but there's an organization, I want to say they're in Massachusetts or Maine, that is trying to document apple trees around the country. And so maybe try doing a search with heirloom apple trees or historic apple trees, and see if maybe you might be able to find that resource. I remember reading an article about that a while ago. And if any of you are watching, if you know what that organization is, please feel free to share it, because There are thousands of varieties of apple trees, and there are thousands of different types of varieties that no longer exist. And so that's what this organization is trying to do, is trying to document, at least in the United States, some of these apple trees that moved with the settlers as they moved across the country, particularly in the 19th century. And they often brought the apple trees with them, and they've been gone from other parts of the country, and that's what this organization is trying to do. Sorry, I can't remember the name. Maybe someone might be able to help you out with it, but there is an organization that might be able to help, and I hope you have some good luck with that. Okay, Forbidden Fruit Company says, "Good morning, Gardener Scott. Made it." I'm glad you made it too. Good to see you here. Good to see everybody here. Glad to see everyone checking in. We've got just about all the regulars that are here. And if you're new to the live stream, or if you are watching this on replay, just type in your question in the chat for the live stream or below this video on the replay. I may not necessarily get to all of the questions on the live stream. I will try to get to all the questions on the replay. But there's a lot of really knowledgeable gardeners that participate every Monday in this live stream. So if you ask a question and I don't get to it, there's a good chance that one of the gardeners that are watching will help you out and give you an answer as well. So don't hesitate to ask your questions. If it looks like I'm falling behind and questions are going by that I don't see, still ask your question, because I might see it and someone else might answer it as well. Okay, Katie says thanks. I'm glad that could help. Okay, Mrs. Marvel says Washington State has a plant clinic as well. They may just know if you email them about that apple tree. Good suggestion. Yeah, Washington, because apples are such a big crop for that state, they probably have a lot of good information. Thanks for that suggestion as well. I want to talk a little bit today about a few different subjects, one of them being soil quality. I've had a lot of questions, and they often come up, particularly at this time of year. If you're growing in containers, or even if you're growing in a big raised bed, the question is, do I need to take the soil out and start again? And that's why I want to talk about it at this time of year. If you're thinking at all that you put soil in your beds, you grew in them, and then someone told you that you have to throw that soil away or dump it out and start all over again, I'm here to say, no, you don't. Even in containers, most of the soilless mixes we put in containers are good for 2 or 3 years without too much worry. Next year, you'll probably want to put some fertilizer in and add some compost if you can. But container soil can go for a long time. Think about people that are growing fruit trees on their patios in the same container for years. You just need to make sure that you replenish the nutrients, put some compost, use an organic mulch, and container soil can be reused for a long time. For your garden beds, especially raised beds, definitely don't toss your soil unless you know it's contaminated and you need to get rid of it. But for the most part, just add more organic material to your soil. Add more organics to the raised bed, like compost and aged manure and peat moss or cocoa coir, leaves, grass, anything like that that's organic. Amend your soil with it. Don't start over every single year. Keep building your soil, because in the first year that you have soil, you'll have an influx of good soil microorganisms. And that's what breaks down all of that material into the nutrients that plants use. And so after a year where you've developed some life in your soil, well, now's the time to increase that life, make it even bigger with more food, and that's where the organics come in. And then next year, there'll be more nutrients for your plants. Eventually, about 3 to 5 years after adding organics every single year, you won't need to add it anymore at all as far as amending and mixing it into your soil. You can just add organic mulch to the top of your soil, and that'll keep the whole system in balance. So don't start over with soil. Just keep reusing your soil, but make it better by adding the organic material, turning it over, getting some oxygen in there, keeping it moist, even in the winter. If you don't have severe winters, water your soil. Even if there's no plants in your soil, go ahead and water it. Keep it moist. Keep that bacteria alive. If your soil freezes, you don't need to worry about watering. But as soon as it starts thawing out, get that water out there. Get that soil life growing. Then when you put your plants in, the soil is a happy soil and your plants will be happy. Okay, Myra's saying, Gardener Scott, thank you so much for answering my questions. Our thoughts are with you and your loved ones. Sorry to hear that. I appreciate your thoughts on that, Myra. All's good on my part. You know, if you saw my video last night, I bounced right back from the issues with the freeze we had, and I'm moving forward. So thank you for that support. Michelle is asking, is there a basic time for how long seeds will last? Yes and no. So generally speaking, 3 years. Most seeds should last at least 3 years. But it does vary by the type of plant. So for instance, onion seeds are only viable for about a year. A whole bunch of plants are viable for 3 to 5 years. And then you'll have plant seeds like tomatoes and peppers that can easily last 5 to 10 years with good storage. And good storage being a cool, dark, dry location. And so generally speaking, if you're buying seed packages, you can definitely reuse them the next year. If you haven't planted all that seeds in that second year, go ahead and plant them the year after. That's typically what I'll do. I'll keep all of my seed packets for about 3 years, and I'll plant each of those years. And then usually in that third year, that's when I order some more of the varieties that I like to grow. So that's a general guideline, is 3 years. Most of the seed packages will give you at least that amount of time, which is great because so many of the seed packets have hundreds of seeds and we might only be growing dozens of plants. So don't think you have to buy new seeds every single year. Go ahead and reuse the packages into the second year for sure. You can expect that the percentage of germination is going to drop over time, but there's no reason to throw away your seeds after the first year, and in almost all cases after the second year. So hope that helps. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Jennifer and Laura are talking about carrot seeds. I actually am letting some of my carrots go to seed this year. And if you haven't seen my video about carrot seeds and saving seeds, go ahead and check that out because it's one of my favorite plants to collect seeds from. And it's because of Laurel's comment. A carrot plant makes 50,000 seeds. So even the carrot plant itself doesn't have much confidence in its germination rate. Exactly. And I show that in my video. Actually, I didn't count the seeds, but I did rough math of the few carrots that I was growing. Thousands and thousands and thousands of seeds. Now, the germination rate will definitely improve if your soil is good. I did that one year at the Galileo garden where I saved the carrots, and it's a biennial plant, so you need to leave your carrots in the ground over the winter, and then the following season they'll send up their flowers and they'll seed. And so I did that one year to collect the carrot seeds in the garden, and again collected thousands and thousands of carrot seeds, gave away thousands to the students at the school. But because there were so many of these seeds, and I let quite a few of the carrots go to seed, the seeds blew into the other beds, they blew into the pathways, and by comparison to a lot of the seed packages you buy, Sure, the germination rate was low for the seeds that landed in a path or landed in another bed. But if you think about it, if you have 5,000 seeds that are blowing around your garden and you only have 10% germination, well, you've now got 500 carrot plants that are popping up in beds that you don't necessarily want carrot plants to pop up in. So I love carrots. Same thing with onions. I had onion seeds, the same thing happened where they were popping up everywhere. It was great for the compost pile as I pulled all those plants, but the saving of the seeds with the carrot seeds, another example, 3 years. You can expect the carrot seeds will be viable for about 3 years, and then it's time to let more of your plants seed and collect them. And that's pretty much what I do about every 3 years, is I let my carrots go to seed so I can save them and keep going with the cosmic purple. That's what I'm letting seed this time. Okay, so we say, good morning. How to solve a transparent dot in my chili plant leaf? Thank you. If it's a transparent dot, my guess is it's an insect of some type that has chewed away either all the way through the leaf or at least in the upper surface cells of the leaf. So try to get close into your plant. If you see transparent dots, or they're usually a shape. So an insect will often chew a leaf in a very distinctive shape. And so if it's transparent, that tells me it's probably an insect that has chewed away at it. Bacteria tends to be irregular patterns on the leaves, and fungus the same thing. Fungus will sometimes have a distinct color as well, but as far as dots, it could be a bacteria, but most bacteria problems have colors to them. So there are bacteria problems on peppers and tomatoes that are dots, but they'll typically be a brown or a black or a red color. So if it's transparent, it's probably an insect. So look closer to see if you can identify some insects that might be eating your leaves. Okay, Nicholas Rice is saying, I was watching another channel's latest video and they were harping on plant genus separation if you're planning on seed cultivation. What are your thoughts? It depends on the plant. So yes, that should be a concern. And so for instance, carrots. Queen Anne's lace is a flower that many people grow in their gardens, and it is very closely related to carrots. So if you want to save carrot seed, then you shouldn't have Queen Anne's lace growing anywhere in your landscape or your neighbor's landscape, because it could contaminate your carrot seeds. The same holds true with squashes. If you're growing a squash or a pumpkin, a zucchini, any of those closely related plants, they will cross-pollinate, and you should have some concerns about using that seed, because it probably will be hybrid seed and you won't be able to use it again. So genus separation is an important consideration if you intend to save pure seed. Now, the way I deal with this, I talk a little bit about it in my video that I did recently about hand pollinating squash, is you can rotate your planting time. So you'll plant the seeds of a squash, for instance, that you want to save seed from early in the season. That plant will produce the male flowers and the female flowers and then the fruit. And so it's only that particular type of squash that will be pollinated by that particular type of squash. If you have another squash that you want to save seed from, just wait. And so put that seed in a month later. And go ahead and stop or cut off all the flowers on the first squash. And so it's succession planting, basically, so that you can save seeds. And so the first squash, squash A, you harvest that fruit, you collect those seeds should be pure, and you can now plant the seeds and get more of squash A. You've started squash B A month or two later, now that plant will flower, pollinate itself, fruit, you save those seeds. Now you have pure seed for plant squash B. That's the best way to try to keep seed pure. As far as trying to physically separate your plants in the garden, it can be extremely difficult. Honeybees will easily fly half a mile. And so to expect that you separate your plants by 50 feet from one bed to another in your garden, that's not going to be enough separation from the insects that will be pollinated. And so that's why the suggestion comes out to separate by genus so that you don't have to worry about potential cross-pollination with similar plants. It takes a little bit of work. It takes some planning. It takes some of that calendar manipulation so you know when you're growing your plant. Or you just grow one type of plant. So next year, as I've mentioned before, I'm going to be growing popcorn. I'm not going to be growing any other type of corn. So by growing popcorn, now I can save those seeds for the following year because there's no other corn in the garden to cross-pollinate it. Those are a couple different ways that you can ensure your pure seed. But there's also many plants like tomatoes, for instance, and beans that will self-pollinate. So I don't worry too much about separating the varieties of those type of plants because in most cases the flower will pollinate itself. So as far as the separation of the genus, it depends on the plant. It depends on whether you're going to be growing another plant within that genus and how many seeds you actually want to save. So yeah, there is some validity to that point, and that's probably some of what that video was discussing. It all comes down to how much you want to do. There's a lot of times if I'm growing squashes, I'm not even going to save the seed. So I grow all the different kinds of squashes that I want and then just not concern myself with the seed because the previous year I only grew one type of pumpkin, saved those pumpkin seeds so that the following year I have less stress and less worry and less planning when it comes to the seed saving. Okay, John is asking, I harvested 2 spaghetti squash this year, but they were planted next to my zucchini. Will they cross-pollinated? Yeah, probably. There's a pretty good chance that the zucchini cross-pollinated the squash and vice versa. You can still save those seeds and you can still plant next year whatever that plant happens to be. It probably won't be a zucchini. It probably won't be a spaghetti squash. It may be some new discovery that you really like. I'll do that occasionally too. I'll intentionally put seeds in that I know were cross-pollinated. But if you grew the spaghetti squash with the intention of saving those seeds, well, next year I would suggest you take some effort to try to keep them from being cross-pollinated by the zucchini or any other similar type of plant. Okay, Bettina's saying, thumbs up, peeps. So grateful for all the knowledge being shared with and among us all. Yes, thumbs up to all of you as well, because I'm seeing a lot of good information going back and forth. Chris is saying, I learned to 7 times key limes in 1 gallon of water is too much acid. Good. That's the kind of stuff that I was talking about gardening journals, keeping track of what you learn through the gardening year. That's a good example of that. If you try something and you find out it's too acidic, there you go. Make sure you make note of that or tell the rest of us so we know it and we'll remind you in the future as well. Okay, I also want to talk a little bit today about preparation for cold weather. Now, I have 2 videos in this last 2-week period where I talked about the cold that was coming, the cold damage that I had, and of course, typical in my region of Colorado, we've got 3 weeks of forecast with no temperatures anywhere close to freezing. So garden's going to bounce back, all the plants that survived. For those of you in a similar situation where maybe you had a frost or a freeze because of this weird Arctic front, you probably got good weather ahead. Or if you haven't had any of that cold weather yet, but you know winter is coming, now's the time to start thinking about it. And I'm going to be building So cold frames, you can expect that video maybe in 2 weeks. But I wanted to throw the idea out now because I'll have a video, but my video, of course, won't answer all the questions. There's many ways to do it. But this is a really good time of year in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere when it comes to developing protective measures in your garden when it comes to plants. And so I really think September and October, again, for both hemispheres, is a great time to think about putting a cold frame in your garden. And so in the Northern Hemisphere, if you put a cold frame in your garden and you start some seeds, they'll be able to grow, and when the freeze hits, the cold frame will protect those plants and they can continue to grow. In the Southern Hemisphere, a cold frame will start by warming the soil, and you can put seeds in earlier than a lot of your other garden beds and get a head start on the season. Then as the temperatures continue to warm, you just take the top off of the cold frame. And so if you're not familiar with cold frames, it's basically a regular planting bed, but it's covered usually with glass to make a solid top. And that glass allows the sun to roll through during the day, warm up the soil, and then help keep the air within that planting bed warm and the soil warm. And what I'll show you is how I do it from reclaimed material, because you don't need to spend a lot of money on it. But it is something that takes some time to build. It takes some time to plan where you're going to put it. You need to think about your sun, the angle of the sun at your particular latitude. There's more to it than just putting a bed and covering it with glass, though you can do that. But now's the time to start doing a little research. So if you're new to gardening and you're not familiar with cold frames, here's a homework assignment. Try to learn more about cold frames and see if it's something you want to try this year. If you're a more experienced gardener and you just haven't done cold frames yet, go for it. This could be a perfect year. Who knows what this winter's going to bring. And if you've done cold frames, I'd like for you to share any of the tips for the rest of us as we're moving forward and building some of these cold frames, because it can be very effective. It can actually give you, depending on what kind of materials you use, you might be able to gain 2 hardiness zones without too much difficulty. So that means I'm in zone 5B. By putting my plants in a cold frame, within that bed, it's effectively a zone 7B as far as the temperatures are concerned and how the plants will make it through the winter. So an idea I'm throwing out to you to consider, and I think it's something that more gardeners should do. And believe it or not, in all my years of gardening, I actually haven't used cold frames that much, because by the time the snow and cold comes, it gets cold and snowy, and I'm not always wanting to go outside on a regular basis. But I'm going to do that this year, filming it, keeping track of it, talking about it, all that kind of fun stuff. So start thinking about it, start doing some research on it, and then I'll have a video coming out in just a couple weeks. Brooklyn Giraffe says, "Hi, Gardener Scott. I really enjoy these live chats and love your supportive and friendly gardening community. Thanks for sharing all of your wisdom with us. I learn so much every week." Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And as I've said many times before, I love doing this. So I like it even more when you can tell me that it's making a difference. So thank you so much. Carla, good to see you back again with your super chat. And I've told you this before. It's so heartwarming to see that and to see you returning. Thank you for sharing your garden wisdom, and I really appreciate the timely garden emergency vid, saving me lots of money and trouble. Good. I'm so glad to hear that. The storm that hit us, that barreled through Montana and Wyoming into Colorado, was not as bad as forecast. So a lot of people in my area were able to save their plants, and I'm glad my video was able to help. My daughter was able to save their cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers with a really sturdy covering of a tarp. Now, I was at her house suggesting how to do that, but it was the same stuff that I put in the video. My area still, we hit about 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's see, that's about -3.5 Celsius. And that was just too cold for any of the protection that I had in place. But the protection I had over the cool season plants did great. All of my fall crops, my fall garden crops, came through fine. So I'll be working this week on actually clearing out a lot of those dead and damaged plants. And that's why I wanted to mention cold frames, because that's where I'm headed next. I'm going to be putting some double protection on my beds and going to be trying to do some winter gardening, which I haven't done much of. So you'll be able to follow along on the journey. So thanks again, Carla. Okay, let's see what else we have. Yeah, Jay Dixon is saying to Jim Edgar. I didn't see Jim Edgar's question or comment. Ash on plants was discussed at the beginning. If you're in the California, Oregon, Washington region, and even Colorado, the winds are shifting, so we're supposed to start getting some of that smoke and ash from our own fires in addition to the West Coast fires. If you have a situation where the air is cloud or smoky, you don't necessarily even need to see the ash for you to realize that your plants are probably suffering. If you're having trouble breathing because the air is so smoky, and especially if there's ash in the air, well, your plants are basically breathing too. It's called transpiration. And the stomata, the little cells that are on the underside of the leaves and the top of the leaves for photosynthesis, all of that needs to be clear. And if they get clogged up, or if the air isn't providing enough of the resources that the plants need, the plants are probably going to suffer. So get out there, wash off your plants, do all you can, because if you're suffering from the fires, your plants probably are too. Even if you're not even close to the fires, ash really can cause some potential damage. In the short term, in the long run, that ash can actually increase pH. If you've got an acidic soil, it might actually add some potassium to your soil as well. So there can be some benefits in the long run. In the short term, take care of your plants, wash them off, do all that kind of fun stuff. Okay, good to see everybody checking in. Yeah, Frank is saying saved mine in Pueblo. Pueblo is just down the highway from me, but now I've got a counter and a refrigerator full of unripe peppers and tomatoes. Yeah, I did the same thing. I brought in all of my unripe tomatoes. I've got a ton of squash, a whole bunch of sugar pumpkins that aren't completely ripe, and I'm dealing with the same issue. What do you do when you've got a whole bunch of unripe fruit because you harvested everything expecting that everything was going to die, and then everything didn't die? If the plants are still healthy and it looks like you'll get more harvests, then I would say go ahead and use some of that unripe fruit in your compost pile. That's one of the things that I'm considering, especially since I have so much squash, and after a while you get tired of eating. At least I get tired of eating squash. But if you harvested plants expecting them to die and they didn't die, be thankful for that, move forward with a harvest, and try to find another use for that unripe fruit. Put them in your worm bins, put them in your compost, or learn how to cook green fried tomatoes. So there you go. So Isabel saying, for small gardening Quebec, everything is dead at the end of September. And that's why I wanted to throw out the idea of the cold frames, is because most of us garden in summer, and then when the cold comes, for me it's typically the end of September or beginning of October, and then we call that the end of our season. Well, I think it's really challenging to move past your normal season, both on the front side and on the back side, and see what other things you can grow. And so there are some really hardy plants. Spinach is my favorite, that can grow in snow. So even if your season's coming to the end in September, Isabel, consider maybe expanding your garden a little bit and trying to grow some of those really cold season plants into the winter. Just a suggestion. Okay. John Ann, good to see you again. Hi from ash-covered Northern California. Lost lots of plants already from the ash load and the lack of light. Sorry to hear that. I hope it clears up soon. I saw that there's some rain moving in along the coast that should help. My mother actually lives on the Oregon coast. They haven't been threatened by the fires, but they have had a lot of that ash and smoke. So I hope it clears up. And I'm concerned. I have a daughter in Portland. Actually, I have a lot of family in Oregon. I have a daughter in Portland. And I don't know if you saw the news reports, but yesterday, Portland, Oregon was reported as having the worst air on the planet because of all of this smoke. So she's suffering through. I'm hoping it all blows out soon. And I hope all of our plants, all of your plants, recover from all of this. Okay. Good to see the conversations popping back and forth. Jen Mars is saying, Illinois here, not looking forward to winter. Have my spinach and lettuce in. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to winter either, but I started spinach. I actually showed it a little bit I talked about it in the video last night. I started spinach a few weeks ago. It's doing great. I'm going to be starting some more spinach this week. And then when I get the cold frame in place, I'm going to be putting some more spinach in there. So spinach is just so easy to grow and so hardy, and a lot of the lettuces as well. So not looking forward to winter, but as I've mentioned in previous videos and live streams, it's so wonderful in November and December when it is winter, when it is cold, when it is snowy for those of us that live in those type of regions, to go outside and harvest some of those fresh greens and bring them in. It makes it all worth it. So I don't like winter either because I can't be outside in the warmth, but I can be outside and still be harvesting. Jay Dixon says, cold frames. I would be most interested in cold frame designs that can be folded, stacked, removed for small spaces and community gardens. Interesting idea. And so the design that I'll be doing is very simple. I'll just be taking 4 boards, reused boards, screwing them together to make a box, and then I'll be digging out the front corner of the box and angling that bed into that spot. It can easily be disassembled at some point. So consider basically just screwing boards together to make a cold frame, and then you can unscrew them for storage. But as far as folding and stacking, I'll have to think about that. If I can come up with a good solution, maybe I'll include it in that video. That's an interesting thought, Jay. Okay, Sharon, thank you so much for that. Sharon C., I appreciate that super chat. Always nice to see it. It's wonderful to have that participation and that support. Thank you. Okay, what else do I want to talk about? I want to talk about microclimates. And this also plays into a little bit about cold frames, because essentially a cold frame is creating a microclimate. But much more than that. This is a great time of year, again, for both the northern and the southern hemisphere. Spend some time in your garden observing for microclimates. And a microclimate is an area within your landscape, within your garden, even within the beds, where part of it has a different weather pattern, a different microclimate than another. And so a good example of this is a south-facing wall in the northern hemisphere, or a north-facing wall in the southern hemisphere. A wall that gets the full force of the sun. Well, you have that wall or fence that's heating up during the day. And through radiant heat, through convective heat, through reflective heat, that wall is causing the area right in front of it to be warmer than most other areas of your landscape. And so by observing and seeing those type of locations, you can modify how you place your beds and what kind of plants you put in those beds to take advantage of the microclimates. And this is a great time. This time of year where it's almost fall or almost spring, we're thinking about our plants, thinking about that shoulder season and whether our plants will survive or not as cold threatens. Well, a microclimate can give you some of that extra protection. So I've talked before about covering your plants with plastic and hoops. Well, if you also throw into the mix a microclimate, you can gain, again, another hardiness zone or two by putting beds where the sun shines more, where it's more heat, and so you can gain that advantage. And the inverse holds true as well. Start looking at areas that get shade, because those are the areas that are probably going to freeze first. So if you have a frost damage potential and you see a forecast with a frost warning or a freeze warning, well, you can expect that the areas of your garden that get a morning shade are probably going to have more damage than the areas of your garden that have morning sun. And that's where the microclimates come in. Look to see how the sun, how the shade, how structures, how all of these components work within your garden. Learn from it this year so that you can take advantage of it next year. I have an apple tree, an espalier apple tree, right in front of my garage wall, intentionally, so that I can get that heat, so that apple tree is a little bit protected from the elements, but also gets a little more warmth. I did that on purpose. I have one of my beds that gets sun earlier in the afternoon. Well, that's the bed that I planted a lot of my cool season plants, because right about the time that the heat of the day was on top of the tomatoes and the peppers, that bed was just starting to get a little bit of shade. So I was able to grow beets in that bed that didn't bolt. And that's where I have my carrots as well. So look at those type of things now in your garden. Really, really stop and try to analyze how these things play. And often it's obvious. If you have a long row of plants and you notice that all the plants on the left side are taller than all the plants on the right side, you may have wondered, why don't these plants on the right side grow as quickly as the plants on the left side? They're the same plants. It could be of a microclimate within that bed. It might be the sun and the shade. It might be the way the wind blows. There's lots of those things. So I've been doing this on a regular basis. I'm doing it even more now, and I've actually noticed a few new things in my garden that I didn't notice last year at this time, because now I've got some beds in place and I can really focus on how the microclimates are playing out in my garden. And as I put in some perennials next year, I'm already marking where I'm going to put those perennials based on the microclimates and how I can expect those plants to grow in that particular location. So I'm just amazed by microclimates and how they can be so prevalent, even in a very small garden and a very small landscape. And if you learn how to use them to your benefit, you can really have a lot of success with your plants, because you're putting the right plant in the right location and it will definitely grow better. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. Any other questions? Let's see. Thank you, Jay, for talking to Nadine. The same as well, Kevin. Thanks for talking to Nadine. I appreciate that. Lauraful saying, in the winter, the sun is very weak, but the light comes in at a shallow angle, so you get all of it. I'm actually planning on talking about that in the cold frame. That's one reason why you want to angle a cold frame, so that the sun's at a shallower angle, and so all of that sun comes in and you get full sun in that box, where a lot of the other boxes might not get full sun if they're completely vertical. So good point. Nicholas Rice says, Garner Scott, does greenhouses fall into the concept of microclimate similar to cold frames? Sorry, listening to you while working if you said this. No, I actually did say it. But yes, essentially a greenhouse is creating a microclimate. Absolutely. The cold frame does it on a much smaller level, but it's exactly the same principle. A greenhouse absorbs the heat, keeps it in that greenhouse. The air is warmer around the plants, and the plants are able to grow when it's cold outside. Exactly. That's a microclimate. And a greenhouse is an artificial way to create that microclimate, just like a cold frame. So if you have a greenhouse, definitely take advantage of it. Even within a greenhouse, you will have microclimates. You will have some sections of the greenhouse that are hotter and some sections of the greenhouse that are cooler. You'll have some sections of the greenhouse that will have more sun, some sections of the greenhouse that will have more shade. All of those are microclimates as well. So good question, Nicholas. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, greenhouses definitely fall into that basic category. And it does raise a good point. I was talking primarily about getting in your garden and looking around and seeing what microclimates you have naturally, but you can also create microclimates by putting up a wall, by putting up fences, by putting plants in that will shade an area, and definitely by doing cold frames and by doing greenhouses. So there you have it. I appreciate that question. So what do you think about my background? I told you last week and the week before that I was going to try to add some more tech and try to make this live stream a little different. That's a view of my garden and some of my tomatoes that are now dead and gone. But I thought I'd throw that up there to help you think maybe that we're all in the garden today with my backdrop. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thumbs up, thumbs down, like the image, don't like the image, would like to see a different image. I'm just starting with this idea of putting something in the background just to break it up a little bit. And I'd like your input, I'd like your feedback. So let me know what you think about the picture behind me. And if you like it, I'm also thinking about doing some videos. So I actually took some video in my garden with the wind blowing and the insects going back and forth. I thought that might be a little too distracting for this live stream. But if you think that's something I should try, let me know, and I'll give it a shot. So if most of you don't like it, I can take it away and try something else. But if you do like it, I definitely want to know that so I can see what else we can do. Okay, Amanda, thank you for that super chat. Love the new microphone and backdrop. Thank you. I'm trying to make it so much better because it makes it easier for me. If you can hear me and if you can see me, then I don't have to try so hard. So thank you for that contribution. I appreciate it. Okay. Love the background. I dig it, like it, love it. That's good. So good. Wonderful. Like the image. Thumbs up. Looks fantastic. Love it. Thumbs up. Okay. I appreciate that. It was fun learning how to do it and then setting up my office as a little studio. So great. And so Kevin's saying I'd love to see a different background every week. Okay, thanks. I had that idea. And so I started the day with actually some sunflowers in the background, but I thought I'd go ahead and go with the tomatoes today. So maybe next week I'll go with the sunflowers, and I'll definitely try to rotate them out so you have something fresh to see. And also let me know, what do you think? Because I've been trying to figure this part of it out as well. Would you like to see a seasonally appropriate background? So for instance, as I move into fall, I could put backgrounds with the fall colors in my landscape, what my garden looks like in fall. Moving into winter, I could have a backdrop with my garden and the snow and all those kind of things. Or would you rather see summer gardens even in the winter? So I haven't figured that out yet, but definitely love to see your input and what you think about how the backdrop should play with the different seasons. So appreciate whatever you have to offer. So Nicholas is saying green screen's actually better than some I've seen. Thank you. I did spend a lot of time trying to get it right this week, so I appreciate that. Okay, got a yes, got to do it. Carla's saying seasonal backgrounds would be great. Mobizzle is saying I'd like seasonal images of your garden. Okay, good. I'll plan for that. I'll try to keep them happy and upbeat. If I can find some good animal, birds, insects, stuff in my garden happening as well, I'll try to throw those in as well. So thank you, I appreciate it. That's nice. I like that feedback. Gladys is saying I need you to talk about fruit trees, disease, and cure. I am planning a video about fruit tree diseases in the spring. Now, I've been real lucky. My fruit trees have done pretty well. I do have an apple tree that appears to have some rust on it. And that's why I'm planning a video in the spring, because I like to have my own garden in my videos. I don't like to use stock footage. So if I talk to you about a problem, I like to show you what the problem is and that I have that problem. Well, in this case, I don't have those problems with my fruit trees yet. But I am planning that video, and I just need to find some of the footage, some of the pictures to use. So thank you for that suggestion, Gladys. It's coming, but probably at the end of winter. I'll also be doing some videos about pruning fruit trees in the winter as well. Okay, Jay saying any landscape backdrop is good. A mix of pictures anytime. Great. Diane says seasonal. Dinesh P, is there any downside to growing vegetables in raised garden beds with aged manure exclusively without any soil? I think there's some downside to that, yes. And I've said this before in other chats, growing only in compost, I think there's a downside to that as well. I know plants do best when they have a lot of nutrients to choose from. Most plants require many nutrients. We know about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, but plants also need selenium and molybdenum and copper. There are so many micronutrients that plants need that we just don't know about because they typically aren't a concern. They are in the soil. A lot of those mineral-based nutrients are in almost all of our soils, so we don't have to even think about the plants being deficient in those micronutrients. Well, if you grow only in compost or only in aged manure, you're getting some good nutrients. You're usually getting the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium, though maybe not at appropriate levels. But depending on what the animal ate that produced that manure, you might not be getting a lot of those other micronutrients. And so your plants may initially grow okay, but as they age, as they mature, you might see issues with the plant size. You might see issues with the blossoms. You might see issues with the roots or the fruit. And that's often because of a deficiency in those other nutrients. That's why I think there is a downside to only using one type of soil mix or one type of medium that you're growing your plants in. It's so much better to have a mix, even with compost. So if you think about a compost pile, if you're only composting cucumber plants from your garden, well, your compost is going to have all the nutrients that those cucumber plants had in them. And that's it. I like to draw a correlation to pizzas. I think all of us know a pizza. So if you only put one ingredient in your compost, it's like a cheese pizza. It's a one-topping pizza. Most of us aren't that thrilled with a one-topping pizza, and we certainly couldn't eat a one-topping pizza and expect it to be a balanced diet. But if you have a pizza that has everything on it. It's got peppers and olives and mushrooms and pepperoni and ham and onions and sausage. If it's one of those kind of pizzas, now look at all of the additional nutrients that you're putting into your body. Let's not talk about the fat. Let's not talk about the grease. Just the different ingredients on a pizza that you're adding into your body. Compost is the same way. If you put cucumbers on your compost pile, and you put the squash on your pile, and you put some kitchen scraps in your pile, and you put some manure in your pile, and you put some leaves in your pile, you're going to get a pizza with everything on it. And so now when you put that compost as a mulch or a soil amendment, the plants have many more nutrients to draw from. The same holds true with using a single medium. So I think it's better to use manures in your compost pile because it adds nutrients to the compost as a whole. And now when you grow in that compost, you're giving the plants more nutrients. But even that compost will be deficient in some of those mineral-based, those soil-based nutrients. And that's why I say now take that compost and mix it into your soil or put it onto the top. So a little bit long answer to a basically simple question. Yes, I think there's a downside to growing in only aged manure as well as compost, as well as peat moss, as well as unamended soil. If you grow in soil with no organic material in it, your plants won't grow well at all. So it has to be a mix. You have to give your plants everything that they can possibly get from a lot of different sources. Carolyn Medina, thank you so much for that super chat. Appreciate it. And it's nice to see you here on a Monday, talking gardening. Okay, let's see. Dinesh is saying, sorry, to clarify, when I set up my raised garden bed, I filled it with dead branches, then fall leaves and grass clippings, and topped it off with aged horse manure last fall. Great beginning. Great way to fill the bed. I would suggest now go ahead and take some of your native soil and mix it into the top of that bed as well. And so you've got a great start with the branches and everything in the bottom. A great Hügelkultur start. Just get some of those minerals in there. Get some of those other nutrients that will be in your native soil. It'll also improve the structure of the soil by putting some of those minerals in as well. So great start, Dinesh. You're on the right track. I would just suggest go ahead and add some of your native soil, and you'll probably see some really good results. Okay, so Jay Dixon says, what do you mean by compost? Noun, a mixture of various decaying organic substances as dead leaves or manure used for fertilizing soil. A composition, compound. There you go. It's a compound product. That is what I mean by compost. It is a mixture of a lot of different things. A composition of different organic material like dead leaves and manure used for fertilizing soil. Now, I saw some comments recently calling compost a fertilizer, and I like to stay away from that. I don't really see compost as a fertilizer. Yes, it does add nutrients, and a fertilizer adds nutrients. But I've known some gardeners that have been confused by the concept of fertilizing and composting and thinking that compost is all they need for their plants as a fertilizer. There's a lot more to it than that. And as you point out, it's a compound of a lot of stuff. And compost by itself might not be enough to completely provide the nutrients that your plants will need. Okay, Dinesh says, thanks for the detailed answer. I'm glad that I can be helpful and give you the answer. I think it's an easy fix, and you're definitely on your way. Okay, Lauraful says, excuse me, a few of our containers had a ton of potato peelings at the top surface. The plants did badly as the potato peelings sopped up all the nitrogen, but after they broke down, it was the best soil. Yep, absolutely. You'll see that with a lot of things. Anything that you put as a mulch that is not decomposed will rob your soil of some nitrogen right at that soil interface. But once it does break down, then you don't have that issue. And that's one reason why when I talk about the soil, I suggest amending your soil is the primary way to get those nutrients, and then adding the organic material on top. Because if you've got a really nutrient-rich soil, there will be enough nitrogen in it to not even be affected by any nitrogen that might be used by things like potato peelings on the surface. So it's a whole system. It's a whole area of the bacteria and the fungi and the food, the organic food that you're feeding them. So I have a couple videos on that. You can expect a lot more videos to come, because soil really is the key to growing successful plants and having a really good, healthy garden. Okay, let's see. Dr. Trotz, Low Carb Living, says, our yard is too small for composting, but I've seen videos encouraging veggie scraps directly in a raised bed. Has anyone done this? How do you avoid critters? Good question. And by all means, throw your suggestions to Dr. Trot. It's the same issues we were just talking about potato peels. So yes, you can definitely bury your food scraps. And if you've got a healthy worm population, they might be eaten and distributed throughout the bed in very little time. But there will be a nitrogen loss in your soil in that area where you've put your food scraps. So the method I suggest, if you're going to do that, is basically divide your bed into half or at least thirds, and just put the food scraps in 1/3 or 1/2. And don't even plant in that area, because the plants may find a nitrogen deficiency in that soil. And so do it with just half of your bed by enriching it with food scraps or some other type of organic material that's buried. Give it some time. It might only be a few weeks. I usually like to give it a month or two for that material to break down. And then you swap. And you can do the same thing on the other half of the bed. You can now plant in that area where you buried those food scraps, because it should be completely or mostly decomposed, especially if you've ground it up into small particles. And then do the same thing in the other half of the bed. Take some extra effort, but if you can't compost, yes, that is one way that you can enrich your soil by using some of the things that you've got in your kitchen that you would otherwise throw away or put onto the compost pile. Okay, Raymond's saying there are controversies about what to cover or not cover holes of containers and pots with. What's your opinion about this? So if you're talking about the drainage holes, there's a really good website. It's gardenprofessors.com, and they're based out of the University of Washington, and they address a lot of these issues, and they use university research-based information on all kinds of topics of gardening. And they have a whole bunch of articles and their blogs where they talk about covering drainage holes in pots, and also putting drainage, or attempting to put drainage, into raised beds. And what they found through research and through experiments is that when you put something like gravel at the bottom of a pot or a container, thinking that you're improving the drainage, you're essentially stopping the drainage. And it's because of the physics of water, how water works. And so water will work its way through soil when soil is all basically the same material. And then it hits that interface between the soil and the gravel, and it stops. It really doesn't continue draining into that gravel. And so what ends up happening is the soil becomes oversaturated because it doesn't have drainage. So to get the best drainage in a pot or a container, you should have the same soil mix in that entire container. And the water will gradually work its way down through capillary action and gravity, and then drain out the bottom. Now you can put a covering of a mesh or a shard of a broken pot so that the soil doesn't all run out the hole. Typically it won't do that. But don't think you need to have a separate type of material to improve drainage. So there's my thoughts on that. And that's the way I grow in containers. The entire container has the same type of soil, and I've not had an issue with it being oversaturated by hitting an interface like that gravel. Katie Lost, thank you for that super chat. Thanks, Gardner Scott, for sharing your extraordinary knowledge and experience with all of us. You're a great teacher. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's so wonderful to see that. Thanks, Katie. Okay. Let's see, Denver 1865. Haven't seen you on the chat for a while. Good to see you back. Hope you didn't have too much damage when the freeze came through. And thanks for answering Rhonda Jansen. I appreciate that. So I put this in the comments for this live chat. And so I'll throw this out as a reminder. If you type in Gardner Scott or @GardnerScott, it shows up on my screen highlighted. So I'm much more likely to see your question if you type in the @ symbol Gardner Scott. And so thank you, Denver 1865, for offering that suggestion as well. I'll look at the screen, it's right next to my camera. If I see a highlight, it's really easy for me to do a quick read, see if it's a question, and then answer it. Otherwise, I have to try to search all the way through and determine if it's a question or a comment or something else. So if it's a question you think is time sensitive, then please put the @Gardner Scott or Gardner Scott. There you go. A lot of those are popping up right now. Okay, Tamara's saying, how do you harvest sweet potatoes? Mine just started blooming. And so it depends on the type of sweet potato, but the way I've done it before, particularly in a season like mine where I don't have a long growing season and sweet potatoes take a long time to grow in my area, but I'll get down and I'll actually dig away soil until I get down and see, are the sweet potatoes ready to harvest? Are they big enough? Typically when the plant starts getting to that flowering stage, it's a good indication that the sweet potatoes are getting ready to harvest. But get in there, just actually dig away some of the soil and see what you think. If they're the right size that you want, if they're not big enough, you can let the plant grow some more. If they are big enough, then you can go ahead and harvest. Okay, Tamara's saying, again, it's the same question. I guess that was just a repeat. Okay, Danny Pacheco, can you put edamame bean scraps in your compost pile? Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Pretty much any plant you can put in your compost pile. And I was growing some edamame. They didn't make it through the freeze, but yeah, absolutely. Put all of the pepper scraps that you have into your compost pile. Shorty8256, really appreciate all the videos. My husband built 2 Hügelkultur beds. What vegetables should I not grow there, or can I grow anything? Good question. So a lot of it depends on how much soil and compost and other organic material you have on top of the logs or the branches or the twigs. And the reason I say that is because if you grow a parsnip or a carrot, one of those type of root plants where we want a straight root, if it hits that mass of logs and twigs, you're going to have a deformed root. But if you've got 8 to 12 inches of good soil on top of the log part, then you can pretty much grow anything. I grew my pumpkins on my Hügelkultur mound this year. I had about 10 inches of soil on top of all of the branches, and they did fine. So you kind of have to think about the roots and whether you want a nice straight tap root. If you don't, then yeah, you can pretty much grow anything in a Hügelkultur bed. Okay, Kimye is saying, I'm redoing my beds and find no worms. Do you suggest when I amend the soil to add worms? I really don't. And so worms are incredible creatures. If you have an organic soil and you have worms that are native to your area, or at least living in your area, the worms will find your bed. So at the Galileo Garden, it used to be tennis courts. It was surrounded by concrete that was a couple feet deep that held up the fence around the tennis courts. They ripped up all the asphalt. We put in raised beds and some in-ground beds in that area. And one of those bed areas I amended heavily with leaves and grass and everything organic I could find, a lot of compost. And I did that a full year before I put any plants in. And that area was primarily intended to be trees and fruit bushes. It was going to be a food forest area. Came back the next year in spring. Not only was the soil incredibly rich, but there were worms everywhere. Somehow they came underneath the concrete edges, crawled 100 feet to find this bed, and then populated it amazingly well. So if you have good organic soil, the worms will find it. I do not recommend you buy worms and put them in your bed, because the worms you buy are probably not going to be native to your area, and they might not be able to handle your weather conditions. For instance, red wigglers are sold as a composting worm. That's what most people that have worm bins that they're making their worm castings in their house, they'll use red wigglers or maybe a European nightcrawler. Well, those type of worms live very close to the surface. And when the temperature starts dropping below about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, especially at 60 degrees, they start slowing down and they will be killed by freezing conditions. So in my garden, when my beds freeze, any worms that I would add to my beds, I would expect would be killed during the winter. That's why I prefer to have my native worms, the worms that are naturally traversing my garden space, to be the worms that I have in my beds. Now, if I'm digging a spot to put in a plant and I come across some worms in my front yard, I'll definitely scoop up the worms I find, take them to my backyard, and I will put those worms into my beds just to hasten the process a little bit. But I know that those are the worms that are living in my landscape. So I'm just basically transplanting them from the front to the back and not, allowing them to crawl that entire distance. So yes, you can add worms, but I encourage that you only add worms from your own landscape. Arena Kim is saying, can I use comfrey that has powdery mildew to make comfrey tea? Good question. And I wanted to talk a little bit about powdery mildew today because it's very common. I talked some about this last week. I'm not that concerned about powdery mildew because their spores are everywhere. Powdery mildew is extremely common almost everywhere. So if you don't have powdery mildew now, at some point you will. That's how common it is. So as far as using comfrey leaves that have powdery mildew to make a comfrey tea, sure, absolutely. I don't see any issue with that at all. And the fermentation of the comfrey leaves into that tea may actually kill some of those spores. So it may actually be a way to deal with some of that powdery mildew. If you have powdery mildew right now on plants that are actively growing, you can deal with it. It's a fungus, and so you can do some of the things that you would do for a fungus infection. You can use a copper-based compound. A lot of gardeners have found that if they use diluted milk, it'll actually help decrease the powdery mildew. And I've done that. I've had some good results with diluted milk. Or you just let it happen. It's often caused by a lack of air circulation. So if you see powdery mildew on your plants, get in there and prune them a little bit. Prune off the powdery mildew leaves, increase the circulation through those plants, and you should see less powdery mildew in the future. But I'll use those leaves on the compost pile as well, because as I've said before, I'll take that compost knowing that there might be some powdery mildew spores and work that compost into the soil. Powdery mildew needs the spore to be on the leaf for it to grow. If the spore is in the soil, it's not going to affect the roots and it's not going to affect a plant. And now if I put a mulch on top of that soil that had a compost made from some plants that might have had powdery mildew, I have absolutely zero concern that that plant will be infected by the powdery mildew leaves that I put into the compost pile. So sure, definitely use the comfrey leaves in your tea. And when you use that tea, use it as a soil fertilizer. There's still the potential that some of those spores could be in that tea. And so don't use it as a foliar feeding. Don't pour it on the leaves of your plant because you could be adding some spores. Instead, when you're making a tea like that, put it solely on the soil and you should be able to use it without too much trouble. And this actually leads in a little bit to the philosophy that I wanted to talk about this week. And I want you to think about recycling. And so when I say recycling, especially in the United States, probably the first thing that pops to mind is recycling aluminum cans or recycling glass or recycling one of those type of container materials. But what I'm talking about is recycling the things within your garden that you wouldn't normally recycle. And so, for example, comfrey leaves. I have a video on how to make comfrey tea. It can be a very effective fertilizer. So when you have leaves of a plant like stinging nettle or comfrey, those make amazing fertilizers. Rather than just let the plant die and let the leaves fall, especially don't rake up the leaves and throw them away, recycle them, reuse them in your landscape in a way that your garden can benefit. And so the comfrey leaves are just one way to recycle something that you may not have thought about. I recycle a lot of the branches of the trees that I prune to build borders for my garden. I'm recycling the wood to make another purpose. I'm repurposing it. So when I talk recycling, I'm talking repurposing, reusing, basically taking the pieces of your garden and putting them into an area that can benefit from that use. The video that I put out last night that showed how I'm using some of the plants that died because of the freeze that I had hit shows the concept in my pumpkin patch on my Hügelkultur bed of reusing those leaves in place as a way for the soil to be enriched. And I had a comment on that video, and you've probably seen the same thing, where you have a leaf that falls on the ground, it's dead, it might still be alive, but you look underneath that leaf and you see earthworms. That's exactly why I'm reusing those dead pumpkin leaves on that bed as food for the earthworms that I know are in that bed. I'm reusing dead material to benefit the live organisms that are in the soil. And so look all over your garden for those type of things you could use. If you have some long stems, like for instance, sunflowers. So some of the sunflower plants that I grew this year, that main stalk is at least 2 inches thick and it's very sturdy. Well, I actually have to take a saw to cut the plant down at the soil level. All I have to do is cut off the branches, and now that main stalk can be used as a trellis next year. And I've used a lot of sunflower stalks as trellises within my garden. And because they're completely natural, because they look like they belong, you can use them in a lot of your flower beds as a trellis or as a support for other plants, and they blend right in. You don't have to buy a metal support. You don't have to buy a plastic support. You can use some of these plants, some of the tree branches, some of the sunflower stalks as trellises in your garden. So really take some time as you're cleaning up your garden going into the fall, or if you're just starting your spring garden cleanup, take the material that you would normally throw away or just put in a section of your yard because you don't know what to do with it. Well, take some time and try to figure out another use for it. Can you use that as a trellis material? Can you use it as a mulch material if you grind it up? Can you use it as a border on your garden? Can you use it in your pathways? There's so many ways to reuse the organic material in your garden. And especially try to figure out ways to reuse the inorganic material. So if you bought plants to put in your garden this year and you have those black plastic nursery pots, well, find ways to reuse those nursery pots. The easiest way is just grow more plants from seed and use those pots for those plants that you're growing from seed. I reuse pretty much every pot that I can get my hands on. So easy, but I know people every year they'll get those pots, they'll put the plants in the ground, then they'll throw the pots away. Then the next spring they buy pots to start seeds in. Well, forget that. Just bypass the middleman. Don't spend more money and reuse all the pots you can find in your landscape. Look in your kitchen. What can you use in your kitchen as a pot for starting seeds? And in a few of my videos where I talk about starting seeds, I show some of those materials like yogurt cups. I eat yogurt, I save the yogurt containers, and then I use those to start some of my seeds in. So this is a really good time of year to start thinking about how you look at your garden and how you clean it up and what you throw away and what you reuse, because it's a wonderful option for all of us to save money in the garden. If we can recycle what we already have, well, then we don't have to buy new stuff. And I'm all about not having to buy new stuff and taking advantage of what I have. So I'll have some more videos about that. I'll talk more about that in future live streams and future videos so I can show you some concrete examples. But every garden is different. We all have different types of materials. So you, again, another homework assignment, go out to your garden and see what you have that you weren't planning on using again, but now you can. And be creative, be innovative. The video I did last week about rocks, a great example. I took rocks, my grandkids painted them, my daughter painted them to make plant tags in my garden. A rock with just a little bit of paint on it. I didn't have to spend money to buy a plant tag for my carrots and my cucumbers and the strawberries and all the other rocks that are now in my landscape identifying it. So it's okay to be a little creative. It's okay to try some new things, and I encourage that you do that. It's a great way to make gardening more enjoyable, more cost-effective, and you're not adding things to the trash that don't need to be added to the trash. So, Vanessa Kennedy, thank you so much for that super chat, super sticker, keeping it up. I am trying to keep it up every week, every Monday, trying to throw out. It's amazing how fast the time flies because we've reached the end of our time. I look forward to seeing you here next Monday, same time. If you can't be here for the live chat, well, then join us on the replay. If you came in late on this chat, you can watch again on the replay the parts that you missed. It takes a couple days, but I always put the timestamps for the chat in the description. My daughter helps me do that. She's a wonderful help to give you all the benefit. So wait a few days and you can come back, watch the replay, see what it is you missed, and go straight to that particular topic with the question and the answer and whatever information I'm deciding is appropriate for that question. And as we see the end of our time, I hope you have a wonderful gardening week. I'm looking forward to improved conditions. It's not going to be cold, it's going to be warm. I'm going to get out there, start thinking about my winter garden with the cold frames and the extra covering. And I hope you can find a similar type of task in your garden this week as well. Thank you for joining me. I'm hoping this information can make you a better gardener. It's making me a better gardener just sharing it. I'll see you next Monday. Have a great gardening week. I'm Gardener Scott. enjoy gardening.